All right, well, it's 7, so we'll go ahead and get started. Thanks for coming. I hope everyone will enjoy this evening. But let's begin first with a prayer. I want to first start, we're going to pray the Salve Regina, or in English we call it Hail Holy Queen. And you'll see in a little while why that's kind of relates to tonight. So let's just begin with prayer. In the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit, amen. Hail, Holy Queen, Mother of Mercy, our life, our sweetness, and our hope. To thee do we cry, poor banished children of Eve. To thee do we send up our sighs, mourning and weeping in this valley of tears. Turn then, most gracious Advocate, thine eyes of mercy towards us, and after this our exile, show unto us the blessed fruit of thy womb, Jesus. O clement, O loving, O sweet Virgin Mary, pray for us, O Holy Mother of God, that we may be made worthy of the promises of Christ. Amen. In the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Amen. So tonight we're going to talk about, this week and next week we're going to talk about two of probably the most common topics I think that come up when someone wants to either attack the Catholic Church and say that the Catholic Church is not the church founded by Christ. They'll often say the Crusades and the Inquisition prove this. Or people who want to blame religion as a source of evil will also often bring up the Crusades and the Inquisition. So we're going to cover those tonight and next week. Tonight will be the Crusades, next week the Inquisition. If you do engage in conversation with people about this, though, I think it is important to first try to determine what is their point. Whenever they bring up the Crusades and Inquisition and are very critical about it, find out, are they trying to prove that that is showing the church isn't the Church of Christ? Or are they just really trying to genuinely understand the history? If they're trying to say that the Crusades and Inquisition prove that the Catholic Church isn't the one church founded by Christ, then address that. And you can tell them, it doesn't, even if, no matter what you're going to tell them with history and show them some of the myths and misconceptions about it, if that's their point at the end of the day, then just point out to them, number one, even if the Crusades and the Inquisition were filled with sins and filled with immorality, which they won't, it still doesn't prove that the church isn't the one Christ established. Because Christ tells us his church will be filled with sinners. His church will be made of both wheat and weeds. And so the actions of the members of the church do not then make the church not the one founded by Christ. And so it's important to bring that up to them and just say that actually when we have events where members of the church commit sin, it just reaffirms what Christ told us. The church is filled with sinners. All of us, from the Pope to the bishops to the priests to the religious sisters to us the lay people, we're all sinners. And the things that we do not then make the church no longer Christ's church. Christ gave us his church for that reason. Because we're sinners, we need his church to protect us and guide us over the centuries. So for 2,000 years, we've needed his church to help us because we are sinful. We are prone to making mistakes, and the truths he came to reveal to us would be corrupted by us because of our sinful ways. And so he gave us this church to protect truth, the truth that he gave us. And so the church is critical, and the things like the Crusades and the Inquisition don't change that. So even if they were just completely immoral, it doesn't change the fact the church, the Catholic Church is the one true church founded by Christ, given to us 2,000 years ago. So if that is their concern, address it. But if they want to seriously understand the Crusades and Inquisition and what really happened, then hopefully some of the things we'll talk about tonight and next week will help even you to better understand and be able to explain what happened. There are a lot of things that are taught about the Crusades and the Inquisition. Some is fact, some is fiction. And so hopefully tonight we can clear up some of the facts and fictions about the Crusades, and then next week the same thing with the Inquisitions. So I first want to start by asking you all some questions. Now, don't be ashamed. There's not really a right or wrong answer. Hopefully by the end of the night, you'll know the actual answers. I'm not really looking for everyone to be right or wrong right now, but I want to kind of see what are your perceptions coming into it, or what have you heard are things about the Crusades. I'm going to ask some questions and then ask you to raise your hand if you think it's fact or fiction, so we can kind of get a sense for what we think already before we even have this talk tonight. So, Crusades, fact or fiction? So the Crusades to the Holy Land in the 11th to the 13th century were authorized by the Pope. Is that fact? How many think that's fact? Raise your hand if you think it's fact. And then how many think it was fiction? Okay, it's fact. So the Crusades that occurred in the Holy Land from the 11th to the 13th centuries were authorized by the popes. The next question. So the Crusades were unprovoked attacks by Christians onto Muslim lands. How many think this is fact? Just raise your hand if you think it's fact. And how many think it's fiction? Okay. How many don't know? So that'll probably be some people for these questions. Okay, this is fiction. We'll talk a lot about this. This is one of the biggest myths that people talk about. So those who went on the Crusades were a mixed group from kings, noblemen, soldiers, and poor men. A variety of people went. How many believe this is fact? And how many believe it's fiction? Okay, this is fact. So a lot of different people volunteered to go on the Crusades. The Crusaders had to take a public vow that they were fighting only because of love of Christ. How many believe that's fact? And how many believe that's fiction? Okay, and that's a fact. They did have to take a vow, and we'll talk about that. The Crusaders used the cover of the church, but in reality they were zealous and power hungry, and they brought destruction, savagery, and bloodshed to the Middle East. And how many believe that's fact? Okay, how many believe it's fiction? Okay, and that's fiction. This is another really popular myth that's promoted, and we'll talk about the reality of what the Crusaders did and were they really zealous and power hungry. We'll talk about that. The Crusades were acts of intolerance in the name of God. How many believe this is fact? And then fiction. How many just aren't sure? So this is fiction. Again, we'll talk about this one. The motivation of the Crusaders was to seize Muslim land and to convert them to Christianity. How many believe that to be fact? And how many fiction? Okay, this is fiction. That was not their motive. That was not their goal at all. And then the last one. Because of the Crusades, the Muslims have always viewed the West as well as the Crusades themselves in a negative light, and thus we have events of aggression like 9/11. How many believe this is fact? And how many believe it's fiction? Okay, and this one's a little bit more complicated of a question. It is fiction, but we'll kind of explain this towards the end of the talk, what Muslims believed during the time of the Crusades, what they believe now, and some of those issues. But overall, it's fiction. They haven't always viewed the Crusades negatively. All right, so those are some of the popular facts and fictions about the Crusades, and we'll kind of talk about each of those tonight. But a lot of these things that are myths are very widespread, and they're promoted in many different ways. So the myths and misconceptions that we have, they're throughout textbooks, high school, even college textbooks. You'll see a lot of these myths promoted. Even popular literature promotes them. The media definitely promotes them. There was a movie in 2005 called The Kingdom of Heaven. It had Orlando Bloom and Liam Neeson. And this promoted a lot of these modern notions that the Crusaders were power hungry and bloodthirsty, overzealous and greedy, but that the Muslims were sophisticated and enlightened and tolerant. And so it really promoted this negativity towards the Crusaders. And you can even find things on TV, like BBC and A&E did a special on the Crusades, and they promoted a lot of these myths and misconceptions. Now again, this may not be intentional, and usually it's not intentional, but it's just reading these histories without really looking at primary sources, without really searching for the truth. But this special that was done on the Crusades by BBC and A&E, I even heard one of the historians that was interviewed in this special, and he says they completely re-edited what I said to make it sound like what they were trying to promote, and that's not what I was saying. So he didn't even agree with the myths and misconceptions that were being promoted, but they edited what he said, so he says it came out sounding like I was in agreement. And so you have this out there. There was also in the 1950s a very, very popular 3-volume history about the Crusades by a man named Sir Runciman. It became a bestseller, and it again promoted a lot of these myths and misconceptions. Now, he was a historian, but he really didn't use the most up-to-date, current, accurate historical information that was available. So you have these different avenues promoting these myths and misconceptions. So it's not surprising that it is still a very common commonly held notion that the Crusades were very negative, they were greedy and bloodthirsty, and that the Crusades went in unprovoked to these lands. Even in 2005, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Dr. Rowan Williams, he was giving a speech in Pakistan, and he said most Christians would now say that the Crusades were serious betrayals of many of the central beliefs of the Christian faith. And so again, he's saying this, and so we have to stop and say, well, is this comment right? Were the Crusades serious betrayals of what Christianity is about? Former President Bill Clinton in 2001, he gave a speech at Georgetown University. This was after 9/11 had happened. And he basically said the Crusaders swept out of Western Europe, unprovoked and unannounced, sowing destruction, savagery, and bloodshed wherever they went. And this led to distrust that lingered between the West and the Middle East, such that things like 9/11 happened. And then he said that these stories about the Crusades are still being told today in the Middle East, and we're still paying for it. And so former President Clinton was still promoting a lot of these things that are out there about the Crusades. And so we hear in textbooks, in the media, we hear a former president, we hear the Archbishop of Canterbury saying these comments. So we have to stop and think, wow, were the Crusades really horrible? Were they really something we need to be ashamed of? Are they really a stain on the history of the church? But what should make us stop and say, well, wait a minute, are these comments really true? Is because the Crusades were supported by some of the great saints of the church. St. Catherine of Siena and St. Bernard of Clairvaux are two doctors of the church. They both supported and encouraged the Crusades. They lived during the time of them happening, and they supported them and would preach about them and encourage people to go. St. Francis of Assisi was another one who, very well-respected saint, who again supported and encouraged the Crusades. So you have these three saints who are promoting them. You have popes from Pope Urban II in 1095 to Pope Innocent XI in 1684 who are summoning for crusades. They're calling people to stand up and go out and go on these crusades. We have 6 different general councils of the church also legislating for crusades. So when you have this in the background, that you have saints and popes and councils summoning and encouraging the crusades, we have to say, well, wait a minute. Are these things that are being promoted today true? Because if they are, how come they were so supported at the time by the saints and by the popes and by the councils? Fortunately for us, we have many historians now who have really dedicated a lot of their studies to the Crusades in the hopes of trying to find out the truth. And what they have found really helps us to debunk a lot of the myths and misconceptions that exist out there today. And that's hopefully what I'll be able to summarize a little bit tonight. So here's an overview of some of the things that I want to emphasize tonight. Number 1, the Crusades were defensive wars against invaders that were felt to be just wars. When they were called at the time, the people and the Pope thought they were just wars. They were defensive wars. The Crusades were seen as necessary to regain Christian lands that had been taken and to protect the Christian people, both that lived within the lands and that were trying to travel on pilgrimage to the lands. The Crusaders never forced conversions, and they cannot rightly be seen as being unprovoked. The Crusades cannot be seen as unprovoked, and we're going to talk about that history tonight. And then there were abuses, and there were immoral acts committed, but we cannot then condemn the entire crusading acts because of these incidences that occurred within them. So a just war does not become unjust because of some immorality that happens within it necessarily. And so with the Crusades, that's some of what you're going to see. There were some abuses and some immoral acts that occurred, but as a whole, we have to keep those individual isolated events separate when we're looking at the Crusades as a whole. And we'll talk about a lot of the Crusades, and you can kind of at the end make your own conclusions. But before we get to the Crusades, we have to stop. And we have to look at these in context, because the only way we can understand what happened and the mindset of the people at the time is to see the context of what was happening and what the church and the Christians were facing and why it is they felt the Crusades were necessary. So we have to go back, way back, 1,000 years before these things happened. And I'm going to be brief, and hopefully in just about 15 minutes we can summarize 1,000-year history. But this is a picture of the Roman Empire around 200 AD. It wasn't that much smaller whenever Jesus lived, and that's really where we need to start. Jesus entered into the world when the Roman Empire was the great world power. It was a large empire under an emperor who called himself a Caesar. It was a pagan empire, so they worshipped multiple gods, and even the emperor himself was a god. Because it was so large, they were constantly trying to keep peace and stability, so people were required to worship all the Roman gods and the Roman emperor. Now they made an exception. They made an exception for a small group of people. That's the Roman Empire. They made an exception for a small group of people living in Palestine, in that region. This was the Jewish people. The Jewish people only worshipped one God. They refused to worship the god of the emperor. They were not going to worship Caesar. They were not going to worship all the different Roman gods. Now, because they were such a small group, now they were dispersed throughout the empire in small communities, but most of them were in Palestine for the most part. But they didn't evangelize. They weren't trying to really make a big effort to actively try to recruit new members. And so the Romans made an agreement with the Jews. If you'll live in peace, then we'll permit you to worship your one God. They were going to put a governor over the Jewish people to keep peace, but they gave them an exception. They didn't have to worship all the different gods of the empire. So it's in this region that Jesus lived and died. And then after Jesus rose, ascended into heaven, he had his apostles who he sent out throughout the world to go and spread the gospel of Christ. So the apostles go to spread out to the known world everything they had learned from Christ. And they'll even go as far as Rome and Spain and other locations. So the Christian faith starts to spread throughout the Roman Empire. At first they started out as a small group. They weren't a huge threat, but over time they started to grow. And the difference between the Christians and the Jews was that the Christians saw one of their primary missions was to evangelize. It was their vocation in life to go and spread the gospel of Christ and make converts to Christianity. So the Romans start to see this as a threat to stability. If this small group of Christians is going to refuse to worship all the different Roman gods and refuse to worship the emperor, then that rebellious attitude may spread to everyone else. And with our huge Roman Empire, we can't have that. And so one of the reasons, among several others, this is one of the reasons Emperor Nero, starts to persecute the Christians. Now there were other reasons that he had as well, some selfish issues that he had, but he started to persecute the Christians, and so we have some of the first martyrs of the church, Peter and Paul, and several other Christians are killed. And then over the next 250 years, intermittently you will see Christians being persecuted and killed for the faith. And the Romans are doing this for a variety of reasons, but one important reason is they want to keep peace and stability in the empire. They do not want people getting this attitude that we can just worship who we want and we can live how we want, and so they try to suppress Christianity. Now it had a negative result in the fact of the Romans, because this only made Christianity spread more. So as Tertullian said in the early church, the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. So by all those Christians being killed for their faith, they were living witnesses of how important this faith was. So they had a lot of converts to Christianity, and so the Christianity continued to spread throughout the empire. So just a little brief little timeline. So you have Jesus and Peter and Paul. And then you have the waves of persecution. It wasn't a constant every single day for 300 years persecution, but it was these waves that would happen depending on who was the emperor at the time. But the Christians were being killed. The church was not able to express itself publicly. You could not worship publicly. And so that goes on until around 313. So during this same time period, not only is the Roman Empire dealing with some internal conflicts with the Christians and with other groups, they were also being faced with external invaders. The barbarians were constantly threatening the Roman Empire. And so for the first several hundred years, you have a lot of different groups trying to invade the Roman Empire. So the Roman armies were always at their borders trying to protect the empire from these invaders. And so you can see just this depiction of all the chaos that they were causing. So the Vandals, the Goths, the Visigoths, the Huns, and these different barbarian tribes over a several hundred year period were attacking the Roman Empire. So the Roman Empire was constantly fighting for stability and peace because of external invaders and internal turmoil as well. And then we get to the first part of the 4th century, and then we'll have around 312 AD, Constantine is on the rise. And he's a man who ultimately will become an emperor of the Roman Empire. And the important thing with Constantine, this is just a picture of the area of the Roman Empire at the time of Constantine. This is how big it was. And you can imagine trying to keep peace and stability with such a large territory. But we have Constantine around 312. Then we'll have the Edict of Milan in 313. This basically was the proclamation that all people could now be free to worship whatever religion they chose. Basically, you could practice whatever religion. And so the persecutions of Christians ended for the most part at this point. And so anyone could practice whatever religion they so choose to practice in the Roman Empire. And so this was a very important moment for the Christians. Now they were able to come out and publicly worship. The bishops were able to communicate better, and you start to see councils forming within the church. And so the persecutions end for the most part. Constantine will become the sole emperor of the Roman Empire in 324. He will move the capital from Rome to another city that he will rename Constantinople. And so now it'll be Constantinople that's the center hub of the empire. It'll become wealthy and powerful. And then in 337, Constantine will die, and then he divides the empire between his three sons. So you're going to continue to see at this point waves of attacks from the barbarians. They'll continue to pose a major problem for the Roman Empire. And then as to the religion of the empire, Christianity continues to spread, both within the empire as well as to the barbarian tribes. It spread so much that by 378, Emperor Theodosius declares Christianity to be the official religion of the Roman Empire, because by that point, the majority of those in the Roman Empire had become Christian. So it had spread to a great deal. Then what we see happen is in 410, the Visigoths sack Rome. This was very, very devastating. You can imagine living in the Roman Empire. For 400 years, Rome had been your capital. It had been the center of power. It had been a sign of power, of wealth, of stability, of peace for 400 years. And now the barbarians come in and they sack Rome. It was very devastating. You can even see St. Jerome and St. Augustine talking about this, how it was just great heartache for everyone who was Roman. At this point, there just continues to be more and more conflicts and turmoil within the empire for the next 60 years. And then in 476, you have the end of the Roman Empire in the west. The barbarians have invaded so much that the empire in the west has now fallen apart. Now there's just barbarian kingdoms and barbarian territories. So the Roman Empire in the west falls. And so this is another huge blow to the people. And at this point, you're going to constantly see that the west stays in some turmoil for a time. A lot of different barbarian tribes invading. They fight amongst themselves. And then in the east, the Eastern Empire remains united. It's a smaller empire now, but it remains united under the emperor, and the capital is still Constantinople. And with the church, what you're going to see is the church in the east still has really close ties with the emperor, but in the west, the church becomes the really only source of stability for the people, because the barbarians are constantly changing and fighting. And so the church will try to form alliances with some of the different barbaric tribes and kingdoms, for unity and for stability, but also for protection. The church needs to help protect her people, the churches, the monasteries, for these different invaders. The church needed trying to help for unity and stability, and also for protection. So the church will try to form alliances with some of the different groups. And then Christianity will continue to spread. So you have the Eastern Empire that's still powerful, strong, and wealthy, united under one emperor, but a much smaller empire now. And the church is still united closely to the emperor. And sometimes that's not always a great thing. The ties were so close. Sometimes the emperor had too much influence. But in the West, the church is trying to help be a source of unity and stability, trying to form alliances. And then you're going to have this period of time from the late 400s to the 800s where the church is constantly working to form alliances. And that's when you hear of, like, the great Charlemagne will be one of the alliances the church forms. And I'm not going to go into any more of the church history from that standpoint, but it just starts to show you where we are as we approach the millennium. But we need to stop for a second before we continue further talking about the East and the West, and talk about something that happened in another part of this area. We're going to see a man who lived around 610 AD. His name was Muhammad. And he's going to claim to have visions from the angel Gabriel, and the angel's going to reveal to him truths from God. And it's going to reveal everything God wanted man to know. Muhammad would be given these truths. And so he's going to gain a lot of followers. Muhammad is, at this point, living in the area of kind of Mecca, Medina. It's in present-day Saudi Arabia. But he is going to unite a lot of the nomadic tribes in that area into his new faith. And they're going to unite themselves under one God, and that God is going to be called Allah. Now, like Christians, the Muslims have the conviction that what they believe is true. Now, unlike Christians, the Muslims divide the world into two groups. Basically, if you can't read that, it's the house of Islam and the house of war. That's the world. Or some people say the abode of Islam and the abode of war. So that's the world. And the vocation of everyone who lives in the house of Islam is to bring all those in the house of war into the house of Islam. And so Muslims obey and serve Allah, and they believe that everyone else should serve and obey him as well. In traditional Islam, if your neighbors do not believe, then you should conquer them and make them obey Islamic law. And then also, if your surrounding states, the surrounding territories, were not Muslim, then you should either destroy them or conquer them and force them to convert. That was kind of the traditional Islamic ideas at the time. Now, if a person who was Christian or Jew and lived in an Islamic state, they were treated as second-class citizens and just barely better than slaves. And so we'll talk about life in these areas in a little bit. And so this is kind of the very, very basic understanding of Islam. But at this point, Muhammad has some followers, and he attacks the city of Mecca in 630 AD and conquers it. And then 2 years later, Muhammad's going to die in 632. But right before he dies, he tells his followers, he gives them a farewell address. And he says, "Fight all men until they say there is no God but Allah." And so with this, his followers continue to do what Muhammad had requested, and they go and they begin conquering lands by the sword. And they're very successful. We're going to run through some of the places that they do and conquer in a short period of time. So 632 is when Muhammad dies. It's that same year. They his followers take the Arabian Peninsula by force. Then they will take Jerusalem and Palestine in 638. They'll take Egypt by 641, Persia by 650, portions of Italy by 652, portions of Spain by 711. They'll enter France by 732, but they'll be stopped by Charles Martel. They'll sack Rome in 877 and take Sicily in 902. So in a short period of time, they've already conquered a great deal of lands. And actually a third of the lands they had taken had been Christian. And so now you can imagine from the perspective of a Christian. You may be living in the western part of the empire that had been the empire, or the eastern part, and you're faced with turmoil. So if you're in the east, you're united under an emperor, and it's a smaller empire, but there is some stability, but there's still some economic struggles. In the west, there's great turmoil. So as the Christians, they would be seeing the barbarians are continuing to fight amongst each other. You have outside invaders always threatening to come in. Between the east and the west, there's also tension. Economically, there's tension. Culturally, there's tension. Their cultures are starting to be very different. And then religiously, there's also some tension between the Christians of the west and the Christians of the east. There's tension. Now on top of that, you have this group of Muslims who are now invading. They're threatening the east, they're threatening the west, and Christians see what's happening to people who live in these areas where the Muslims are taking over. And Christians see that by 900 AD, about a third of the lands that the Muslims had taken already were Christian. They were attacking in the area of Spain. They were attacking in Italy. So they're coming from North Africa, attacking Italy and Spain. Then they're coming from the Arabian Peninsula, and they're starting to attack Constantinople. And so the Muslims are a threat on everywhere they look. The Christians also recognize that within these Muslim territories, Christians who live there struggled to live. Both Christians and Jews, as I mentioned, were treated as second-class citizens. And so this meant that there were times where they may be allowed to live peacefully, but oftentimes, because of social pressures or because their lives would be threatened, they'd be forced to convert to Islam. Or they'd be sent off as slaves, or they'd be tortured or persecuted. And so every single day, Christians and Jews who lived in these Muslim territories faced daily risks for persecution, enslavement, imprisonment, torture, even death. And so the Christians are seeing that these lands that are being conquered have been Christians, their brothers and sisters, and that they're now living in a state of a lot of plight every day. Not only that, so this, before I get there, so this is basically an example. This is the Christian lands. This was all the different colors or various, some of them are slightly heretical beliefs, so it's just kind of showing there are some heretical beliefs among Christians that are spreading. But in general, these would all have been considered Christian lands. And then we see the Muslim threat. So all of the brown arrows are the Muslims' threat. The green, yellow, red is all conquered territory by the Muslims. And the purple is what remains of what was the Roman Empire and what is the Christian lands. So the purple is what remains. The rest was what had been conquered by the Muslims. This is around by 800 AD. And so the Christians realize about a third of their lands have now been taken by 900 AD. So this was, the outline in blue is just all the lands that Muslims had taken within a span of 250 years or less. And this is just another map of a little bit later in time. But by the end of the 11th century, that we'll talk about here in a minute, by the end of the 11th century, 2/3 of Christian lands will have been taken by the Muslims. And so again, outlined in red is where the Muslims had advanced by the end of the 11th century. So by 1100 AD, they had advanced even further. So not only do the Christians recognize what's happening and that this Muslim threat has become very grave and serious, the people living within these Muslim territories are not, they're struggling to live well. Not only that, Muslims also destroy churches and monasteries in the territories they conquer. So not only are they killing the people, they're also killing the churches and the church property. In 936, they destroyed the Church of the Resurrection in Jerusalem. It was later allowed to be rebuilt, only to be destroyed again in 1009. El-Hakim was a notorious Muslim leader, and in the early 11th century, he destroyed about 30,000 churches by some accounts. These were primarily in Egypt and Syria, but also some of the churches in Jerusalem. Whenever the Muslims invaded territories, they sometimes were very cruel. They also would destroy the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Before I get back to that story, the city of Ardzin was an example of just some of the cruelty that happened. And this happened in about 1048 AD. But the Muslims were conquering this city, and the citizens saw they weren't going to win this war. So they surrendered to the Muslims. The Muslims accepted the terms of surrender, which at that time would have meant, we're laying down our swords. We do not want any further fighting. And so that was the terms of surrender. The Muslims agreed, but as soon as they entered the city, they massacred 140,000 people that lived there. And this wasn't the only time that they did this. Now, it doesn't mean that every time they conquered places they were doing this, but it wasn't unheard of that they would be doing cruel things like this when they would conquer a land or a territory. So, and then as I mentioned, they destroyed the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, which is the church of the tomb of Jesus Christ. Then there was a group of Muslims that moved into Jerusalem. These are called the Seljuk Turks. This is basically non-Arab Muslims. These were Muslims, their origins weren't from kind of the Arabian Peninsula, but the non-Arab Muslims come in. They increased the persecutions of the Christians living in Jerusalem, living in and around it, significantly. There's one example of the Bishop of Bamberg, and he was traveling to Jerusalem with 12,000 pilgrims. They get within 2 miles of Jerusalem on Good Friday, and the Muslims massacre them all. And so the Christians realize, they know that these things are happening to their people. They know that their churches, their lands, their monasteries are being destroyed. Their people are being killed or tortured or imprisoned or even sold as slaves. So they recognize this is happening, and so they realize the Muslims are a significant threat. But at the same time, the Christians in the West are dealing with a lot of turmoil within the West. Those in the East have their own internal conflict and issues as well. And then it's going to, the issues for the East, the Christian Byzantine Empire is going to increase. In 1071, the Muslims are going to fight the Christians of the Eastern Empire in a battle called for the city of Manzikert, which is in Asia Minor. The Muslims win and they wipe out the Eastern army. They capture the emperor of the Eastern Empire. It was a very devastating loss. And if you look at a map, I mean, they're entering in now to present-day Turkey, basically, on their way to Constantinople. So every victory they win, they're getting closer and closer to Constantinople. So the Eastern Empire sees this threat that's getting closer and closer to their capital. So the emperor, who a few years later after this battle, he reaches out to the west and to the Pope, and he asks Pope Gregory VII for help. He says, we really need help. These Muslims are getting closer and closer. We need your help. So Pope Gregory puts out a call to people, but because everyone is so caught up with other things, I mean, the Muslims are invading the West. They're invading Spain, trying to invade France. They're invading Italy. You also have the barbarians still trying to invade. The kingdoms within themselves are fighting. There's social and economic and religious tensions between the East and the West. So no one really answers the call that the Pope sent out. No one steps up to send any help. The next thing that happens is the Muslims then take Antioch. This is another step closer to Constantinople, and this was in 1085. The Muslim attacks are getting more and more aggressive as well. And at this point, by 1085, when they take Antioch, this is over half of the Eastern Empire had now been taken by the Muslims. And as a whole, over 2/3 of lands that had been Christian since the time of St. Paul have now been lost. So over 2/3 of the Christian lands were lost. Half of the Eastern Empire had been lost. The Eastern Empire again sends a plea to the Pope. We need your help. And this is when the Emperor sends a plea to Pope Urban II. And because of this, Pope Urban II calls for the First Crusade. This was in 1095 when he calls for the First Crusade. He will call out to people and say, take up your cross. Let's defend our Christian brothers and sisters. Let's defend the Christian Holy Land that's been taken. Let's help out our brothers and sisters. And there's an overwhelming response. Some reports say that thousands upon thousands responded. Some estimates say there may have even been 100,000 people that responded, with about 60,000 trained soldiers and fighting men who responded. And then in 1097, the First Crusade begins. But before we go into the details of the First Crusade, I think we have to stop and first say, well, what is a crusade and what was the purpose? What did Pope Urban II call for? And what were the expectations of these men and women who stepped up to go on these crusades? So the Crusades, if we look at the word crusade, it can be broadly used to refer to several things. It can be a campaign involving any type of military or social, political, religious action. The term crusade is really a more modern term. In 1095, when Pope Urban II called for a crusade, he really wasn't calling for a crusade as we know it today, and that the people at the time weren't called crusaders. Those are more modern terms that we've given to these historical events and figures. And so we are the ones who later in history called them crusades and crusaders. The most well-known crusades were those in the Holy Land that we're going to talk about tonight, where the Christians go into the Muslim conquered territories between the 11th and the 13th centuries. These are the most popularized, most criticized. We're going to talk about those tonight. But there were other crusades. These were not the only ones that happened. So between the 11th and the 18th century, there were many other crusades that were called by the Pope. Some went to France to defend the church against heretics, like the Albigensians, or also called the Cathars. And there were other heretics they went out to defend. They went to Austria, the Balkans, and Spain. So there were other crusades that were called during the 11th to the 18th century. But tonight we're going to focus on the ones that are the most popularized, and that's the ones that went to the Muslim Holy Land between the 11th and the 13th century. Now, at the time that these crusades happened, historians say that the Crusaders, which is a name we've given them, they would have actually probably called themselves either Cruces Signati, which means those signed with the cross, because as you'll see in a minute, those who go will sew a red cross into their garment. Some other terms that the historians say that would have been possible back at the time of how the Crusaders would refer to themselves would have been Fidelis Sancti Petri, the faithful of St. Peter, or Militis Christi, the Knights of Christ. And these would have been some terms they may have used at the time. But again, I'll still call them Crusaders tonight, but at that time, just don't forget this is more of a modern term for them. So the Crusades, there's a historian by the name of Jonathan Riley Smith, very, very good historian who I think if you're going to be wanting to read more about the Crusades, he's one of the people definitely to refer to, and we'll talk about that at the end. But he gives this definition of a crusade. He says it's a war pilgrimage proclaimed by the Pope on Christ's behalf, waged for the recovery of Christian territory for the defense of Christian people. And I think this is a very important definition. We're going to break that down. So for the first thing, the Pope. For a crusade to be legitimate, it had to either be called for by the Pope or endorsed by the Pope in order for it to be legitimate. The Crusades were considered pilgrimages, which meant they had a very important penitential component and a penitential aspect, just like any pilgrimage. The people saw themselves going on a pilgrimage, basically renouncing their children, their families, their property for a short time, going into exile on a pilgrimage. Just like anyone back at that time may have went to the Holy Land, or like people may go today, they're going on a pilgrimage. Very penitential aspect to what took place. But the difference was that it was a war pilgrimage, because they were going with the intention of fighting a war. The purpose of the fighting was for the recovery of Christian territory and for the defense of the Christian people. So it was a war pilgrimage, so a very penitential component, but they also recognized we're fighting because we're trying to go and defend Christian territory and defend the Christian people. And because it was seen as a defensive war, at the time they did consider it to be just, because they were going in defense of Christianity and defense of Christ. And when they went on the Crusades, they did go for the glory of God. They were going because of their love for Christ and their love for God. Now, who were these Crusaders? Sometimes you're going to hear people questioning the motives, so we'll talk about that. Were they going for wealth and fortune? Were they proud and barbaric? Did they go to force the Muslims to convert, or were they going to colonize the Middle East and try to increase the lands that they ruled over? So the first point, so who were these Crusaders? They were people that came forth voluntarily, so that's a very important component. They're volunteers, and they would take a temporary vow. This temporary vow would be binding. They would take it publicly, and in doing so, when they're taking this vow, they're vowing to uphold the goals and terms of the crusade set down by the Pope. By taking this vow, they would take a red cross and then sew it onto their garments in acknowledgement that they've taken this vow publicly and that it was binding. They would also take temporary vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. So they'd be renouncing their wives, their children, their property. They would also take the vow of obedience to the Pope. And so they would definitely be acknowledging publicly that they were vowing to obey the Pope, obeying the rules and regulations of the Crusades. And just as an example, we'll talk about this a little more in a minute, but one of the requirements was that they had to go to weekly confession and weekly mass along their pilgrimage. They were also given, the Pope also said that he would give an indulgence to those who went on the Crusades and completed their mission. And so this was another motivating factor for many people, not only for love of Christ and love of their Christian brothers and sisters, but for this indulgence. You can read a lot of the writings from the Crusaders, and they would acknowledge the sinfulness of their life, and they wanted to do penance. And one way of doing penance was on these Crusades, going on a pilgrimage, and they'd receive an indulgence. When they went and took this vow, they would then be given certain privileges. And there's several things that the Pope would promise them, but one of the things that they'd be promised, that if they left their family and their property, the local church community would promise to protect that property and their family so that no one would harm them. So particularly a lot of times it was the men that went, or the firstborn sons that went. And so when they went, they were worried about their family and their property, so the church promised to protect their property and their family when they went. That was one of the privileges. They also were promised the privilege of anywhere they went. If they were in a Christian land or Christian territory, they would get hospitality along the way. So food, and then supplies when they were available, shelter when it was possible. So that was another privilege. And there were several other privileges, but the Pope promised them some things if they would take the vow. Now, the idea of permanent vows did develop later. At the beginning of the First Crusade, this did not exist, but as time went on, this became a necessity. But a permanent vow was someone who came forward voluntarily and joined one of the military orders that would form. So the Knights Templar, the Knights Hospitaller, the Knights of the Holy Sepulchre, and others, men would take permanent vows to join these communities, and they would promise to protect the Christians and the Christian Holy Land. And so that was part of the vows they would take, plus chastity and poverty and obedience. They would take these vows. They would oftentimes join these permanently. So it'd be a permanent vow they would take. And the different military orders had slight differences as to what their purpose was, but we're not going to get into that too much. Now, when the Crusaders went on the crusade, why did they go? Was it for wealth and fortunes, as sometimes many people will accuse the Crusaders of doing? Their motives are for wealth and fortunes. Well, when the Crusaders went, they went at great cost. When they went, it was a huge cost, both to their life and to their wealth. As to their wealth, war is expensive just like it is today. It was expensive then as well. It was estimated that about 4 times the annual income per crusader was needed to go on the crusade. Most of those who went on the crusades bankrupted themselves in order to go. They would sell property, give up their possessions in order to raise money, to at least try to support one member of their family, if not more, to go on the crusade. And so most of them were very willing to do this, though, because they felt that this was an important calling, and it was a duty of Christians to help take care of their brothers and sisters. There's records of families who impoverished themselves to support one member of the family going. There's even records of why a family gave up their property, and then the documentation talks about the Crusades. And so they would use their own money. Now, eventually, over time, the church would start to raise some money to subsidize the Crusaders, but early on, this was not something that happened. But even later, the Crusaders were still depending a lot on their own finances to help fund their crusade. They also left family behind. That was another cost of going. And then the loss of their life. They went at a huge risk, knowing that their life was at stake. And they knew before they left the risk that they were taking. And it's reported that after the First Crusade, about 75% who went died. And so that's an estimation, but there were large numbers who went and died. And most people knew this from the beginning. They knew the cost that it was going to take in order for them to go. So when we look at the cost of going, cost of their fortunes, cost of their possessions, leaving their family behind, risking their lives, then we have to say, well, did they go for wealth and fortunes? And the answer is no. Most of them came back just as bankrupt as they had left, if not worse off. The Crusaders' motive was to defend the Christian lands and defend the Christian people because of their love for Christ and because of their love for their Christian brothers and sisters. And we're going to come back to talk about that point. But that was definitely the point that the Pope emphasized, and as you can see by what the Crusaders were willing to selflessly give up, love was really at the heart of why they went. One of the Crusaders said that, "I come across the sea in order to die for God in the Holy Land." And this is just an example showing that before he even left, he knew what was going to happen. He knew the costs and the risks that he was taking. He knew that his life was likely going to be given up selflessly for Christ. Now, some people also say that the Crusaders were proud and barbaric and intolerant. The reality is the majority of them were faithful and pious. They saw going as an act of love. They knew what was happening to their brothers and sisters across the world, particularly in those Muslim territories. They knew what was happening to the Christian pilgrims who were trying to go to visit the Holy Land and who were being killed. That one instance of the 12,000 being massacred isn't the only time. It was very, very difficult to go on a pilgrimage at this point. The Christians recognized that everywhere in the world that there were Christians, these were their brothers and sisters, and they wanted to reach out to them in love. Pope Innocent II would later on in a later crusade tell the Knights Templar, "You carry out in deeds the words of the gospel. Greater love has no man than this, than a man lay down his life for his friends." And this is exactly what the Crusaders saw, what they were doing, is laying down their life for their friends, for their Christian brothers and sisters. Now, another important component of why they went on crusades was that penitential aspect I referred to. They saw themselves as being sinners, as we all are, and they wanted to do something great for penance. And so one of the things they could do is go on this pilgrimage as a form of penance. I think I have that on this next one. And so this crusader kind of gives us a sense of that idea. What greater almsgiving can there be than offering oneself and one's belongings to God and risking one's life for Christ, leaving behind one's wife, children, relations, and birthplace for the service of Christ, exposing oneself to dangers for the love of the crucified? And so this is just one example of a crusader's attitude, and it was across the board, the majority of them approached the Crusades with this attitude. Now, as you can see, he's talking from a penitential aspect, this idea of almsgiving. We can see that among all the Crusaders, or majority of the Crusaders. Even in their preparation, before they left for the Crusades, they would start to do penitential things in preparation. We have documentation of King Louis VII of France before he went on the Crusade. He would spend hours in a leper house, praying with them, washing their feet as a form of penance, really trying to prepare properly for the crusade. He also took some friars and said, "I want you to go to all my officials and to all my vassals and find out if anyone has any grievances against me or any concerns, because before I leave, I want to address those." Because it was very important to him that he had everything set and prepared for this penitential pilgrimage he was about to do. The other thing that was another sign of the penitential nature of the Crusades is as they went on their journey, they were required to go to Mass at least every week and required to go to confession every week. But also before each stage of their march, they would walk around barefoot and fast and continue to pray. And they prayed throughout their journey. So the Salve Regina that we said at the beginning, the Hail Holy Queen, one of the historians said that it's reported that a bishop crusader is the one who wrote that prayer during the first crusade as they were marching, and it became one of their great marching hymns. And then they also would say other prayers along the way. And we can even hear the penitential aspect in some of the sermons that they would be given before they would leave. And this is one particular portion of a sermon, and it's in reference to the Crusades. It says, "There is a pilgrimage which is excellent beyond all others, which surpasses other Christian pilgrimages in many ways. For other pilgrimages, people expose themselves to intense labor, but on this one, they expose themselves to death. By this pilgrimage, the common good of Christianity is assisted. By the others, only personal well-being. In these pilgrims, the example of Christ, who went to Calvary carrying his own cross, shines forth." So we really see that even in these sermons that are being given before the Crusaders leave, this penitential aspect is being emphasized. So did all the Crusaders have pure intentions like this? Well, the reality is the Crusades were wars, and there were war pilgrimages. And so to say that there was nothing but piety and nothing but good intentions would be inaccurate. They were wars. And like in all warfare, the fighting was brutal at times. And also like with any wars and any fighting, sometimes there were mishaps and blunders. There also were crimes that were committed. Just as with any human undertaking, not every single person had pure motives, but as a majority, the majority of the Crusaders were faithful and were pious. But again, kind of as I referred to at the beginning, having sinful and immoral acts within these events doesn't then make the entire thing as a whole unjust, and so we have to look at the entire picture and trying to determine that. But there were people who did not have pure intentions, but as a whole, most of the Crusaders did. Now, sometimes there is an accusation that I've heard is that were the Crusaders anti-Semitic. They'll claim that what the Crusaders did is they were anti-Semitic. They would go around and they would kill the Jews along the way and in the Holy Land. That was one of their motives. But that's inaccurate. Now, there was some anti-Semitism happening at this period of time. Actually, it's very surprising, but throughout Europe, there was a lot of anti-Semitism at this period in our history. And so there are some anti-Semitic notions. And unfortunately, there were some people who took advantage of this idea of crusading to then go and do some anti-Semitic crimes. So for one example, with the First Crusade, there was a group of people led by a man named Count Amaco, and he took a little small band of rebellious men who were anti-Semitic, and as the Crusaders were marching along, he would follow in their wake, and he would just he would kill the Jews in the communities that they had passed through. Now the Pope did not approve this. The Pope actually rebuked this, as did all of the bishops and priests. The Pope had the bishops and priests arrest these men as soon as they were found. They were imprisoned. In the Second Crusade, this continued to happen somewhat, and there was a monk even who was leading this rebellious group of people who were killing some of the Jews in some of these communities. And the Pope sent St. Bernard of Clairvaux, and he told him to go take care of it. And so Bernard went to this monk, and he sent him back to the monastery so that he could no longer influence people. Now, most of these anti-Semitic actions were happening primarily in Europe. These people that were doing this cannot rightly be called crusaders. Even if they had taken the crusader vow, they weren't living upholding it, but most of them weren't even really taking the vow. They were just taking advantage of these waves of men marching through these territories, and would just take advantage of it to go and commit these anti-Semitic crimes. These primarily happened in France and England, is what a lot of people say, but throughout Europe these were happening at times. But again, they really didn't have anything to do with the Crusades. They couldn't rightly be called crusaders, but sometimes these immoral things did happen, with people taking advantage of these large groups of people marching through the cities. Now, were these men, these crusaders, ruthless and barbaric whenever they would fight? Sometimes you hear they were just horrible and ruthless and barbaric and worse than any other fighters of the time. The wars of the Crusades were more horrific than anything, but that's untrue. The Crusaders followed the code of war that existed at the time. Now, there were actually some of the bishops around 989 that even made some rules of combat, and the Crusaders even followed these. And so if war was necessary, this code of war said that you must recognize non-combatants. There was also certain seasons and certain days of the week that you could not fight, so this also had to be recognized by the Crusaders. There was a code of chivalry, so the men fighting had to pray and fast. They had to dedicate their swords to protect the weak and defend the church. And there were also terms of surrender as part of this code of war that we'll talk about in a minute. So there was a code of war, and they had to follow that. And it was the same code of war that most of the other groups of people at the time recognized. And so the Crusaders did not fight any differently. War is brutal, but they really were not fighting in any more of a horrific way in general than the others at the time. So that leads us to the First Crusade. So the First Crusade. So in this picture, the First Crusade was called in 1095. They left around 1097. They'll march all the way to Jerusalem. But what you can see is that people from different parts of Europe were coming together, present-day Europe. They were coming together and meeting. They would have rendezvous points along the way. There really wasn't one army. It was a lot of different armies, a lot of different people who were gathering together their own groups of fighters, and then they would rendezvous. And so as you can see, one big rendezvous place was Constantinople, but a lot of the different tribes and groups would meet together, and then they would march. Once they came to the rendezvous point, they would all march together as a whole along the way. So with this, there was never any one leader, and that was kind of put them at a disadvantage. The odds were greatly against them, that you could have this large group of people, some fighters, some not fighters, coming together with no leader, no detailed strategy. They really didn't even have a supply line. They didn't even create a way to get supplies and reinforcements in. They just were gung-ho and marched. They were motivated and went. And so with this, the odds were greatly against them, but they were miraculously successful. So they marched thousands of miles. Some at the furthest point were marching 2,000 to 2,500 miles from home to Jerusalem. And along the way, they'll conquer the cities of Nicaea. You can see that right below Constantinople. Then they'll conquer Antioch and Edessa, and then they'll march to Jerusalem during this First Crusade. Thomas Madden, who is another great historian, who at the end he'll be one of the ones I recommend reading. But Thomas Madden wrote, "The modern historian can only marvel at the First Crusade. I know of no other instance in human history in which so many soldiers marched thousands of miles from their home and endured numerous hardships deep in enemy territory for no good strategic or economic reason. Their reasons had much more to do with the next world than with this one. And so he's just emphasizing that the motivation for the Crusaders was very evident in many of the aspects of the crusading march. And for that reason, it was just something to marvel at. They weren't going for an economic reason. They weren't going to expand a kingdom. They were going for love of Christ. And that alone was the motivation. So they get to Jerusalem around 1099. They surround the city. They get there and they surround the city. Because they basically have surrounded it, the Muslims within Jerusalem have no other option but to discuss surrender to the Crusaders. The Crusaders offer terms of surrender, and these were the typical terms of surrender at the time. They basically say, if you surrender the city, there will be no looting, no pillaging, no further fighting, and everyone within the city will be shown mercy, and everyone within the city could just stay and keep their possessions. So the Crusaders were saying, if you will just surrender and lay down your swords, no further fighting, we'll enter the city and take it over peacefully. However, if you refuse to surrender, then fighting will ensue and there's no guarantees. We can't really guarantee what's going to happen at this point. So they offered them terms of surrender, and then they waited for the Muslims' response. Now, many of the historians will say that at this point there were a lot of people who were probably leaving Jerusalem at the time. Some of the Christians, some of the Jews were probably fleeing and escaping because they saw what was happening and about to happen. But the Crusaders are waiting for the Muslims' response. So what's their response? The Muslims go out and they poison all the water wells that surround the city, and then they refuse to surrender to the Crusaders. So the Crusaders don't really have another choice. They attack the city and they sack it. In 1099, they take Jerusalem. Now, whenever they take the city and sack Jerusalem, there were many that were killed, as with any war. There were a lot of combatants killed, but also some non-combatants that were also killed. But it was one of those situations where it was just like a typical war. Some of it was unavoidable. Some of the Muslims did seek refuge near what's called the Temple Mount, where the Old Testament, the Jewish temple had been. Some Muslims did they ran and kind of sought refuge, huddled together there. The historians do say there was a massacre of the Muslims that did that, but there was never a massacre of the entire city. So some people report that the entire city, everyone was massacred, everyone was killed, there was blood running up to everyone's knees across the city, but that really isn't true. There was a massacre probably of this group of Muslims at the Temple Mount, and then otherwise the rest of the city was a typical war. Once the Crusaders had taken the city, they did allow the survivors to stay in the city. They allowed the survivors to keep their own faith, and they could practice their faith publicly without persecution. And so to give you an idea of the Crusaders' attitude about this, they weren't there to start to gain more and more kingdoms in general. They were there for the Christians and for the Holy Land. And so one of the leaders of the Crusaders was offered the crown of Jerusalem once they conquered it, but he refused. And he's like, I can't be king of Jerusalem. Then they offered it to the next leader, the second in line. He also refused, saying, I can't be king. And so he says, I will not wear a crown of gold in the city where my Savior wore a crown of thorns. And so he again refused the kingship. Now this man did ultimately agree to be the leader, but he says, I won't be called king. I'll be called the defender of Jerusalem, because I just can't be a king of this city. And so what will happen is you'll have the Crusaders will now have Jerusalem. They also have some of the surrounding cities. And I think I have that. So you have these surrounding cities. These are called Crusader outposts or Crusader states. You have Jerusalem, Antioch, Edessa. You also have kind of Nicaea, and there's also going to be Tripoli in that area that they're going to have. So the Crusaders will have these Crusader states, these Crusader posts. Now in these Crusader states, the majority of the population was still Muslim. And so just to give you an idea of the type of leaders the Crusaders were in these outposts, the Muslims were treated very well. They were allowed to live in peace. They could publicly practice their faith freely. They could live by their own customs. They were free to travel to and from Mecca or wherever they wanted to go. There really wasn't any persecutions within these outposts. And then just to really show you an idea of how well the Muslims even acknowledged they were being treated, in the mid-1100s, so Jerusalem was taken in 1099, and then during the next 80-something years, they'll be ruled by the Crusaders. But King Baldwin III, who was one of the kings of Jerusalem in the mid-1100s, when he died, the Muslims of Jerusalem made a public display of mourning, very publicly, to really show their love and sorrow for this man having died. And another important point is to the people in the West, in Europe, if you want to call it present-day Europe, these outposts were not seen as any type of economic benefit to them. They actually were a drain on the resources of all the people in the East and in the West. But the Christians felt that this was necessary. It was a necessary sacrifice to give money and funding to the Crusader states to try to keep the route for the pilgrimages to the Holy Land open and at peace, and to help protect the Christians of that area. So there was no economic benefit for having these outposts. As some people will claim that the purpose of the Crusades was to take over territory for colonialism and to try to expand, but that's not what happened. The other important point is when they went to Jerusalem, some people estimate that they started out with about 60,000 fighting men. By the time they got to Jerusalem, probably about 12,000 were left, and then only about 2,000 stay. Everyone else went back home. Everyone else saw this as a pilgrimage. We went on our pilgrimage, we defended the Christian Holy Lands and the Christian people, we won, now our mission's over, we're going back home. So most of them went back home, they didn't stay. And so the 2,000 men that did stay were there to protect the area. Now they recognized this as really not adequate to protect the area adequately, so they did constantly ask for more supplies, more people, and they would at times get them. But that does end up being a problem here at a short little while later. But if someone claims the Crusaders were going to gain territory and looking for economic advantages, trying to expand their kingdoms, it just isn't the case. Now the Crusaders, they hold Jerusalem for a time, but the Muslims were always threatening. The Muslims still were constantly threatening to reinvade that area. So in 1144, the Muslims took the city of Edessa. So if you remember on the map, it was a little bit north of Jerusalem, but this was a sign of increasing threat. They were taking back some of the surrounding cities, and so the Crusaders saw that as a concern, as did the Pope, and so he called for a second crusade so that he could send more people down to defend the Holy Land. But this crusade failed. They didn't reach the Holy Land, were not successful. Then we have in 1187 a Muslim leader by the name of Saladin, who starts to reunify some of the Muslims that had kind of went into some disunity. He reunifies the Muslims, makes them a little more powerful, and then they retake the Holy Land. And so Saladin retakes the Holy Land. Now sometimes there's some comments about Saladin, about how he was a very non-vengeful man, very peace-loving. He was always a better warrior than the Crusaders because he would always follow the rules, but that's not exactly true. In 1187 at the Battle of Hattin, Saladin wiped out the Christian army. He captured the relic of the true cross. And then we can even read in his biography that he watched with joy when hundreds of Christian prisoners were executed, and he vowed to massacre them all. There's also a chronicle written about this period of time, and it talks about Saladin, how the citizens of Jerusalem, when he surrounds them and he's basically about to invade, they offer surrender to Saladin. They say, we're going to surrender the city. They set the terms to surrender, and Saladin agrees with the citizens, and they agree to surrender the city. But when Saladin enters, he ignores that surrender, and basically he tells the people, I'm either going to kill you or you're going to pay me ransom for your lives. And most of the citizens went bankrupt to ransom their lives. And then what Saladin turned around and did was he still captured the people and then sold them as slaves. And so he wasn't as friendly of a person as some people make him out to be. Now in the year 2000, the U.S. News and World Report actually even said that Saladin invaded Jerusalem without vengeance, unlike the Crusaders. And so we can see really from Saladin's own biography, this is completely false. He was a warrior and a fighter, just like most people at the time, and probably even a little bit more cruel. And as his biography even states, he was watching with joy as the Christians were massacred. Now, as a result of Saladin invading Jerusalem, and taking it back over. A third crusade was called to retake the Holy Land, but again, it failed. You have in this particular crusade King Frederick Barbarossa of Germany, plus King Philip II of France, King Richard the Lionheart of England. They'll come together in this crusade and lead men along the crusade. Now, King Frederick Barbarossa will die somehow along the way. There's reports that he drowned, but he dies, and so King Philip II and then King Richard the Lionheart are in charge. But they have some internal disputes among themselves, and so King Philip abandons the crusade and goes back home, leaving King Richard the Lionheart by himself with a small army. And so he goes on to fight on his way to the Holy Land. He does capture some of those cities, some of those coastal cities by Jerusalem, but ultimately after 2 attempts he cannot take Jerusalem. So in the end he offers a truce to Saladin, and he tells Saladin that we'll leave you in peace and stop fighting if you just promise to let the Christian pilgrims come to Jerusalem peacefully without harming them. So they agree to a truce. Now most of the Christians are not excited about this. They never got to recapture the true relic of the cross at that point, and they also really wanted to regain Jerusalem, but they couldn't. But at least they had this truce where Saladin promised to keep the pilgrims safe, although he did not always live up to that promise. So because of the constant issues the pilgrims still faced, it still wasn't as peaceful an attempt to get to the Holy Land as they would like, plus they wanted to regain the Christian Holy Lands, a fourth crusade was called in 1200 AD. This was called by Pope Innocent IV. Now unfortunately this crusade is the one that has become very infamous because of its unfortunate turn of events. With this one, the Pope called a crusade to the Holy Land, and the Crusaders had decided to travel by sea to get to the Holy Land this time, but they needed ships. So they went to Venice and made a deal with the Venetians to lease them some ships. So they made a deal. After a period of time, about a year or so, the Venetians had the ships ready to go. But unfortunately, the Crusaders could not raise enough funds to pay for the ships. So the Venetians were upset, but they said, listen, we'll make a deal. If you go and conquer this city of Zara for us, we'll call that all your debts are paid. The problem was this city of Zara was a Christian city, and the Crusaders had been forbidden by the Pope to have any mission but going to the Holy Land. They also had been forbidden, you do not attack other Christians, you do not attack other Christian lands, your goal is the Holy Land. So if they chose to do what the Venetians said, they'd be disobeying the Pope. So there was some dispute among them, but ultimately they did go and take the city of Zara. Ultimately, they were excommunicated because of this. And so because they take the city of Zara, they're excommunicated. What ends up happening next is that there's a man who approaches them by the name of Alexius Angelus, and he tells them that I am the rightful emperor in Constantinople of the Eastern Empire, but my father and myself were dethroned and imprisoned, and I escaped, but I need your help to help me get back on the throne that is rightly mine. If you help me, I will give you all the money you need, I will give you all the supplies, and I'll even give you troops. Just help me get back on the throne, and then I will help you for your crusade. So they agreed to do that, even though the Pope had excommunicated them for what they had done in the city of Zara. The Pope had also told them many times, you do not have any mission but the Holy Land. So they're again being disobedient to the Pope. But they go to Constantinople in 1203 and they fight. And they put this man Alexius back on the throne. Alexius works to raise the funds he had promised the Crusaders, but he's not really able to raise enough money, number one. And number two, he's very unpopular with the people, so he is assassinated soon after he's put on the throne. Well, his successor has no sympathy for the West. He doesn't like the West, doesn't like the Crusades, has nothing to do with them, so he refuses to give them any money, refuses to give them any supplies, and so the Crusaders are furious about this. They feel betrayed, and so they ultimately end up sacking the city. They destroy Constantinople in 1204, and it's very unfortunate. They kill many people. Some estimate maybe about 2,000 were killed, but they do also vandalize property. They steal a lot of the church property, the relics, the icons. They do a lot of damage to Constantinople. And it's what they did is really morally indefensible. I mean, the Pope is furious when he finds out about it. He had already forbidden Crusaders, both in the Third Crusade as well as this Fourth Crusade, to not go to Constantinople. The Pope had emphasized on this crusade as with any other, you do not harm Christians. And so when the Pope found out about several months later, he rebuked them, and he wrote to a cardinal, and he said, "These," quote, "soldiers of Christ, who should have turned their swords against the infidel, have steeped them in Christian blood, sparing neither religion, nor age, nor sex. They stripped the altar of silver, violated sanctuaries, robbed icons and crosses and relics. The Latins have given example only of perversity and works of darkness. No wonder the Greeks call them dogs." So he was very upset. And he again excommunicated the Crusaders. Now, anyone who was involved in the city of Zara attack was already excommunicated, but anyone else who hadn't been was now excommunicated again. So even though the Pope was angry and upset, rebuked them, excommunicated them, the damage had been done. There was already great tension between the East and the West, and this really only made the situation worse. What they did is morally indefensible, absolutely. But it's important to note, there's a historian by the name of William Carroll, and he says that this is morally indefensible. This was horrific what they did. But he also said that we also need to stop and take a look at this in context, because this was not completely unprovoked. And so to understand the tensions between the East and the West, there's a couple of incidences that William Carroll says that we have to also keep in the back of our mind. So not only were there political tensions between the East and the West, cultural tensions between the East and the West, there were religious tensions, but there were also horrific crimes that the East had committed against the West as well. And again, it does not excuse anything that happened in 1204, but 20 years before the Fourth Crusade, in 1182, there were citizens from the West who lived in Constantinople, including the papal representative, and they were killed, they were massacred by the East. So about 4,000, or several thousand were killed. Another 4,000 were sold as slaves to the Muslims from the West. They said that the papal representative was beheaded and his head was dragged through the streets. Bodies of Westerners were exhumed and abused. It was just an act of hatred for the East against the West. And there were some economic and religious disputes and tensions, but they committed this horrific act about in 1182. Then in 1188, if you remember, the Third Crusade had Frederick Barbarossa, the King of Germany. He was leading it, and he had asked for permission from the Eastern Emperor, Isaac II, could we pass through your lands and cross one portion of the sea on our way to the Holy Land? And as we do, could you also give us some food, let us purchase some food, and maybe even purchasing some other necessities that we need? Well, the Emperor Isaac agreed. He told Frederick, sure, come on through. But what ended up happening is Isaac was actually in cahoots with Saladin, the Muslim. He had actually made a deal with Saladin that he was going to betray Frederick and the Western Crusaders, and he was going to allow for Saladin to capture them just right outside of Constantinople. And so this is kind of termed Byzantine